Okay, welcome to number 11, Discord Q&A. Haven't actually put any new questions in the doc. This is still the same stuff, but yeah, I'm not in any danger of running out of questions, so I'll refill the doc at some other point. So, let's get into it. Zizerot changes and why Hullbreaker is boring. So this was a post about like, hey, I liked having the minions, I liked having something that pushed with me, and Hullbreaker just making myself better at pushing is boring. This is something I've talked about a number of times on stream. I've probably talked about this in previous Q&A questions, but I'll just rehash it here just for the purposes of this sort of question. And the reason why Hullbreaker works for the game, although obviously we've made it a lot less good at pushing specifically and a lot less good at sidling, and we don't think that's as necessary as the original version, but the reason why Hullbreaker functions in the modern game and items like ZZ Rod and Banner of Command have been removed is that those other pushing items that we had didn't actually require any person to be there to push, right? They were not really pushing items in the sense that they really just were used as macro tools instead. They were just, oh, actually, when I buy a ZZ Rod, it's not because I want to push the side lane as Scion, it's because I want to put pressure on a side lane as Scion while I myself group with my team. And we don't really find that to be a particularly compelling output for the item system. We generally don't believe that that's actually good for the game when these champions have the ability to purchase an item that we can only cost them so much for, that then puts a macro test onto the enemy team of, can you manage this like side lane pushing activity correctly over the course of the game. We don't really generally we don't find that to be the most interesting way of progressing the game. And so yes, I think to ultimately look at this question, or sort of look at like the theme, the sort of thrust behind this question of, would a version like a modern take on ZZ Rot work if it required someone to be there, or if it if it was very weak and bad at pushing on its own without the support of the user or without the support of an allied champion? I think the answer is I could definitely see something like that working. And in fact, over the years, every couple of years, someone tries something like this. I remember a particularly memorable one when we were testing the mythic item update, where there was a tank item we were testing that could drop this like gigantic ZZ Rot minion into a lane, but only under like a bunch of conditions, and you had to stay with it and all of that. And it was pretty cool. It didn't work for a number of different reasons, but there was definitely something cool about that, something interesting about that thing. And it's the kind of space where there's a clear enough fantasy win. It's clearly interesting enough that I wouldn't be surprised if we keep revisiting it for prototypes. But just because we revisit it for prototypes doesn't mean that we'll ever ship anything, because I think at this point we've kind of said, implicitly with the changes to things like Phalites or with the introduction of things like Phalites and Overgrowth on the turrets, we're kind of saying we actually want to spend the time systemically supporting people split pushing and like having side laning, regardless of what kind of champion they are, right? That's part of the purpose of Overgrowth, is that even if you're not Jax, you can still get value by hitting the tower once, which means you could do that as, a Scion or a Shen or whatever, right? Even if you don't have any damage built or anything of that kind, right? And so I think the relative value of these items, the relative value of prototyping these items, is a little bit lower in the modern day, because we have systemic ways to support split pushing that is not by super strong split pushers. But the fantasy of these items is there, so that is always something that causes people to want to try out these prototypes. I myself have never made one. Maybe I should try at some point. They're definitely cool, right? I personally was a big enjoyer of the old ZZ Rot, for example. I did quite like buying it on Shen and stuff like that, and actually pushing with it, which was not optimal, but was something that I enjoyed. So yeah, I don't have too much to say here other than that I get why people think Hullbreaker is boring. I tend to agree. It, I think, functions for the purpose that we have for it in the current game, but I don't think it's particularly exciting while it does that. Let's talk about this. Current version of Wit's End feels miserable. I tend to agree with this as well. I think that the idea, the sort of foundational principles around why we put Wit's End into its current state made sense, right? Hey, this is supposed to be an anti-mage item for some of these, when we wanted, the intent of the designer who was working on it originally, who had a lot of way more out there ideas that we didn't do, that we did test, but I won't get into that. But yeah, the idea was, hey, this is an anti-mage this is an anti-mage item or an anti-magic damage item, and most of the time you're buying this, it's because you're against double AP or triple AP. And his intent was to enable it to, the reason why I put tenacity on it specifically was, hey, this is a melee skewed stat, right? Tenacity is much better on melees than it is on ranged champions. We're going to put this melee skewed stat on this, and it'll actually be a good way to make it so that you can still buy tabbies in lane. But if you need MR later on in the game, often you need tenacity. And for some of these champions, he was specifically thinking about champions like Master Yi, especially like, oh, it'll be awesome to be able to buy Wit's End while not being forced to get mercs in order to get tenacity at all. I think that hasn't really worked. I think that tenacity it's a stat that I actually still think today that it makes sense for melee on-hit champions, like melee champions that want to buy some on-hit items, should probably have access to tenacity somewhere in their system. That doesn't have to be for mercs. I think that makes a lot of sense that champions like Aurelia, Master Yi, Belveth, Viego can have access to a tenacity item that doesn't require them to buy mercs, because there will just be games where they can't reasonably buy mercs, but they still want tenacity. I think that all makes sense, and we don't really let them buy items like Endless Hunger, which is a new tenacity item, or like Sterak's Gauge, or at least it's hard for them to get those items because they don't buy enough bonus health to make that work. But I don't think that Wit's End is supposed to be that item, is sort of my conclusion that I've come to after seeing this version of Wit's End. I think in general, there's a bunch of different things we could do for Wit's End. Factually, I think power-wise, it seems like it's okay. I think it's probably one of our weaker items, but it's not like terrible, right? When you think about it, to be clear about this, when I say something is one of our weaker items, I don't mean that that means it has to be buffed, right? Half of our items are going to be on the weaker side of our items, and half of our items are going to be on the stronger side of our items, right? Because if you theoretically could, list out our items from strongest to weakest, which would be pretty difficult, but if you could theoretically do that, right, half the items will be weaker. And I would probably put Wit's End, I would guess, is probably in like our bottom 25% of items, and it could definitely be stronger. I think especially for melees. But ultimately, when I look at the item, I think there's a number of different ways we could improve it, right? For one example, it's like we could just say the damage scales a little better for melees, right? It scales with level or something like that if you're melee, or it scales with level generally, and it scales better for melees, whatever, right? It's like I think those kinds of things could be value up for the item. But I suspect to do a really good job at this of making the item actually feel good and make sense in the on-hit system. Number one, we probably want to redo the on-hit system. This is something that I've really in my opinion, I think we should do. I think the on-hit system is just not really working in its current form. And number two, even regardless of whether we redo the system or not, I think there's larger scale changes that could be done here, because I actually don't think this is supposed to be the tenacity on-hit item with MR. I think this is supposed to be a much more generic MR purchase that doesn't require you to feel like you need these specific outputs, like these narrower outputs that the item currently has. As an example, just imagine the version of the item that like stole MR. I actually was pretty partial to that one. I quite liked the steal MR version of this. Where, hey, it's not just about having MR, it's about hitting someone a couple of times and then you have the maximum MR, so it's not as good against burst. Okay, I think that's pretty reasonable. It's great on Master Yi. You Q in and you sack it fully, right, in the current version, right, in theory. Obviously, Master Yi Q didn't apply on it back when that happened. But, in theory, though, right, like things like that where it's about figuring out how to hit people first before you get, Lissandra ulted or whatever. But yeah, I tend to agree the current version is not in a great state. It's functional, right? It works. It does the thing that it's supposed to do, but not in a way that I think feels good for the users, especially the melee users that we were intending to get the benefit of the tenacity. Even the range users, I think, look at this item and they say like, well, I guess I'll buy it if I have to get MR, but I'm not excited about it, right? Like, when you think about like the Kog'Maws and the Varuses of the world or whatever, right? They're not excited about this item at all, which, if no one's excited about the item, then I think that's a good sign that, unless it's doing something structurally really important, that's kind of a good sign that we should be looking to change it at some point. So, curious to know why the designers have opted away from including more niche versions of CC, silence, taunt, stasis, other forms of CC from other MOBAs. So, a couple of things going on here. One point I would say is that these forms of CC are more narrow and tend to have more specific purposes in order for them to be useful or for them to be functional on kits or better than other forms of CC, right? The defaults are things like slows, roots, and stuns. They're easy to understand. They have very clear use cases, and everyone in the game can clearly understand what's going on there. Conversely, you look at something like taunt, and you kind of have to ask yourself every single time you see a taunt in a game, why is this a taunt comparatively to, say, a stun, right? With Rammus E, for example, that's very obvious. Well, it's because he has a damage reflect. He wants you to auto-attack him. Okay, cool. With Shen, I think it's a little bit thinner, right? Like, why is Shen E a taunt? Well, in the original version, who knows, right? But at least in the the reworked Shen, it's well, he has the ability to dodge auto attacks, and so this puts some interesting considerations on him around when he's going to use his abilities. He has a shield that has a short cooldown. He also has the ability to block auto attacks, and so him having a taunt instead of like a stun means that he has all this interesting extra mechanical baggage around being able to like move people around slightly and stuff like that. But it also gives him additional considerations for how he's going to use his defensive spells. Galio is an interesting one where I would say mainly the reason is that he has a taunt is, well, because the old Galio had a taunt on his ultimate, and so Galio has taunt on W, and Galio, because he slows you so much, it's mostly just a slightly worse stun for him. But I think that's mostly just a legacy thing. In the modern day, like, would we make it a taunt? I don't know. Like, if we were designing Galio from scratch, I don't know, because we probably would make him pretty differently if we were looking for that kind of experience. Anyway, but when you look at these things, a lot of the use cases that you can find in League are, this is very clearly designed to a very explicit purpose, right? Soraka E, I think, is a really good example of this, where I actually really like the shape of Soraka E as a spell. It says, hey, you're not allowed to use your spells, but if you can walk out of this and use them, and also, by the way, you really do want to get out of this, because if you stay in it, you're going to get rooted. I don't necessarily love a lot of the properties around like it being instant and damaging people on cast, and that's part of why we had to reduce the damage of it significantly and reduce the rank up incentive and all of that we did to Soraka E. But I think the shape of the spell is actually a really, really, really interesting one, because it creates the exact gameplay that we want. It causes Soraka to have to think a lot about placing this particular spell, which is really interesting because she doesn't really have to think about her other spells at all. So it gives her somewhere to put the mind share around, okay, what do I want to do with this spell? Do I want to try to make them walk backwards? Do I want them to have to move forwards? Do I want to predict where they're going to go? Do I want to try and layer it with another CC? It has a bunch of really interesting properties that it has because it's a silence specifically, rather than being like, I don't know, like a slow, or her having like a skill shot root or something like that, or whatever, right? Whatever other things that she could have there. I think it's a really interesting spell shape, and I think the silence is really works for Soraka's kit on her E specifically. But those types of spells or those types of effects are more narrow, and it's a lot easier to design something to just be a stun or a root or a knock-up or whatever. I will say I do think there was an era of champion design in League where champion designers did overuse knock-ups because they're pretty easy to make satisfying. You can actually see your opponent getting visually knocked up into the air, and that they can't take any actions. That's generally going to be a lot more satisfying than just stunning them or rooting them or whatever. And of course, it's more powerful. But the amount of extra satisfaction you get comparatively to the power that you're spending is a pretty good deal, I think, from a champion designer perspective. And so I think we did over index a bit onto knockup specifically. But the reason why we haven't made these, I don't think, is necessarily because the champion designers aren't looking for places to use these. It's just more that these alternate forms of CC are more narrow and require the right types of kits and the right types of spell shapes, and we just haven't made those kinds of things in the current day, right? A lot of our more recent champions have been more of an approach, or more of a back to basics, right? When you look at someone like, say, Yunara as an example, it's like, well, she has a slow, right? That's all she has. But she's don't even talk about the CC part. Look at the mechanics that she has. She's sort of a back to basics AD carry. She's just all about fundamentals. You attack people, you're good at attacking people, and your ultimate makes you even better at attacking people, and you can dash a little bit, right? It's like, yeah, this is an AD carry that's about the fundamentals. You look at Hui, for example, and you say, okay, this guy, all of his spells are going to need to be pretty simple, because he's got 9 of them, right? Like, none of his spells individually can be super complex, and so we're not going to make a Soraka E, right? We're not going to make a Bard ult on this guy. We're not going to make a taunt, right? Obviously, because he's not a tank. Uh, you look at a champion like Smolder, and you say, well, he doesn't have any CC, but he's also a fairly simple, straightforward champion, right? He doesn't have any super new mechanics. You look at Ambessa, and it's like, well, she does one really interesting, very different mechanical thing, which is she has her passive, and that's cool. But that's not related to CC, and really her ult could have been a stun, but for thematic purposes and for animation purposes, it makes sense for it to be a knockup. Okay, sure, right. I don't think that these CCs not appearing super frequently is a result of designers moving away from this, but just a function of we haven't made that many champions, and a lot of the champions that we have made have been targeted more at, hey, this is a back to basics 80 carry, or this is a mage with 9 spells, and therefore none of the spells can individually be very complex, right? Stuff like that, right? Or hey, this is a dashy skirmisher who's all about this passive that has to be able to dash her after every spell. So that's really where all the power budget of the champion is going, and also a lot of the complexity budget of the champion, so none of the spells can be very complex. These types of CCs tend to lend themselves much better to more highly complex individual spells that are more about those spells, and we just haven't made those kits in the last couple of years. And also, we just don't make nearly as many champions as we used to, right? So as someone who if for whatever reason you particularly like really weird types of CC, of course you're not seeing as many of those in the modern day because, well, we just make fewer champions. And so I don't actually know what the rate of using like weird CC is on champion kits, but I don't actually think it's super significantly different today, or like that the perspectives of champion designers are super different. It's just that we make fewer champions and we haven't hit on a champion concept where we would particularly want one of these, is my perspective on this. I don't think it is the result of, oh, we don't like taunts or we don't like silences, right? Or anything of that kind. I think that silences in particular and stasises in particular are very difficult to find good places for because they're just so narrow. And taunts are likely like tank only, so they have to be on a, they probably have to be on a tank almost, almost for sure to make sense, right? That's why, the taunts that we have are on like Rammus, Shen, and Galio. But and Galio's kind of a fake taunt. He slows you so much. It's so hard for you to hit him during his W. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But yeah, that's kind of my perspective on this, is that I don't actually think this is the result of moving away from these CCs, more so just the result of fewer champions being made and the exact types of champion shapes that we decided to make. Do you think there will be another champion who can change the state of CC like Seraphine can? I think this is a pretty cool mechanic. I think the idea of like upgrading CC is very cool. And I wouldn't be surprised if someone wanted to explore this in the future. Kind of similar to how we have some of these mechanics that we made in the past. And it's like, oh, actually, that was a pretty cool mechanic. And maybe someone wants to take it and make a kit that has that again, or a kit that has a more enhanced version of it that's played up, right? Windwall existed, and we made Samira W, right? Like Braum E existed, and I think led to people thinking, oh yeah, this mechanic is pretty cool, right? There's a number of examples of this over the years in League of, hey, here's a thing that you can do, right? I think like Urgot W to Asol W is a really interesting comparison as well, of like, oh, here's a spell that says you can attack while moving, sort of, but like it's not really your attack. Oh, Asol W is a spell where, hey, you can sort of use your attack replacement while moving, but you have to move in a straight line specifically, and it slows you to use your attack replacement, right? It's like that's kind of an evolution of the Urgot W mechanic, which I think is really interesting. And so I wouldn't be surprised if this is something we've revisited in the future on, say, like a support tank or a support enchanter. I think it's the kind of thing that works really well for champions in a duo lane, because I think it's a lot more interesting when there's someone else there. The fact that this makes Seraphine combine really well with Ashe, for example, I think is actually pretty cool and interesting. So I wouldn't be surprised to see this for someone in bot lane, particularly a support. Maybe like a jungler could be cool. Like, hey, I want to combine. Like, I want to play with allied laners that have like big slows because I'm going to upgrade their slow into a root or a stun or whatever, right? I think it's actually a pretty cool concept, and I could definitely see something like that working. I can't guarantee that we will or won't do this. I'm not even a champion designer. I just work with them. But from my perspective, this seems like a totally reasonable thing that we could do, that I wouldn't be surprised if someone wants to explore in the future. Why does Actualizer build path have Lost Chapter? This is pretty simple. It's because I didn't want to have a loose mana crystal in the build path, and we don't have any mana crystal items that I can build into besides Lost Chapter that makes sense for mages. I agree the signaling on this is bad. It says, here's a Lost Chapter, which is the premier first item mage, your first epic mage item, mage component. But there's just nothing else I can do, right? I've tried this before, having loose components in the system, right? Actually, I would say Dusk and Dawn is a good example of what this looks like. It has a loose dagger, which feels kind of bad in the system, but I think a loose mana crystal is even worse. And so the options are, hey, have a loose mana crystal, or give this thing the stats that it's supposed to have and just put Lost Chapter on it and have the signaling be kind of weird. I'm going to take the weird signaling instead. I want, like, those are the stats that I wanted Actualizer to have are AP, mana, and haste, right? Okay, well, Lost Chapter has those stats, and I think it's better to have a weird sort of off-putting, like off-signaling build path than it is to have a really bad-feeling build path that just has a loose mana crystal in it. That's pretty much it. Really not anything too complicated there. Is it possible for other low elo skewed juggernauts to get the Yorick treatment? This is a really interesting question to me because I actually don't look super favorably upon the Yorick changes. There's parts of it that I think worked out pretty well, but I look at the Yorick changes from today and I say, did we? Well, number one, I don't think that they were worth the amount of effort that we put in. Right? He had to get significant amounts of time spent on him. He was in the patch notes, almost every patch for like half a year, something like that. Maybe not half a year is an exaggeration, but a lot of time, right? He was in the patch notes quite a bit. Took a lot of work to get him back into a healthy state after the multiple sets of changes for Yorick. And so I don't really look at those Yorick changes and say, oh yeah, we should be doing the same process to other champions. Now, I think from the perspective of skew reduction, this is an interesting topic of discussion, because the reality here is that Yorick was far more skewed than the other juggernauts, right? You look at champions like Alawi, like Set, and I don't know, what's another good example for juggernauts, like Garen, I guess. But you look at these other low elo skewed juggernauts. By the way, Darius is not one of these. Darius is actually high MMR skewed, just for anyone wondering. Just interesting side fact there. But these juggernauts are just so much less skewed. I just don't think it'd be worth doing spending meaningful amounts of time doing work on these champions. Oh, Mordekaiser's another one actually that I was just thinking of. But I don't think it'd be worth spending a lot of time to make them, 1% better in high MMR at great time cost and at great risk of making people like the champion less the way that they are today. Right now, this doesn't mean that I think these champions are perfect by any means, right? I think that there's lots of things that could be better. I think Set is a really good example of a champion I think could be better in a lot of ways, where I think that currently he has too much of his power budget in W Flash and not enough of his power budget in punching, right? And part of the W Flash thing makes him low MMR skewed, right? But anyway, there are small things I think we could do, but I think something on the scale of the Yorick change list I'm pretty skeptical of, both because it didn't work for Yorick and because these other juggernauts are not nearly as low MMR skewed as Yorick was. And so I look at this this suggestion and I'm kind of skeptical. Like, I don't think we would want to do things that were similar to the Yorick, the Yorick changes from, what was that, last year or the year before? I don't know, whenever those Yorick changes were done. I don't think we would want to do anything similar to that, but a very small scale version, like small shifts, like say, hey, we're doing a, nerf to Set or whatever, and we decide to nerf his W because that's the low and more skewed part of his kit, and next time we need to buff him, we buff his Q because that's one of the high and more skewed, or whatever, right? Like, there's those kinds of things. I think those kinds of smaller shifts could be good for these champions. But at the end of the day, I don't think it's a problem if some champions are low or high MMR skewed, right? There are obviously degrees of this that are far too extreme, right? Where they become unbalanceable. But I don't think any other juggernaut actually is approaching that territory of being unbalanceable because they are too sharply skewed towards one MMR or another. I do think there are some changes that could benefit here that might be a little bit de-skewing we could do. But ultimately, when I look at this question, is it possible? Yes. Is it likely? I think not. I think it's unlikely we would try to do anything in this space for the reasons that I've kind of outlined here. All right. Is there a way Riot can make tanks scale with items without just scaling PvP damage? Yeah, I would say so. I've been trying to make items that do this for years, right? The items like Jack Show, items like Protoplasm Harness. Uh, these items, both of those are like capstone scaling items. Now, I do think that Heartsteel does warp this a lot, where all of the health stacking build paths, because of Heartsteel, scale a lot of damage for tanks. Um, and I don't particularly love that. I wish we had a health stacking build path for tanks that wasn't heavily about dealing big chunks of damage with your Heartsteel. But Heartsteel is also a really fun and awesome item. So at the same time, I'm also like not offended by the structure that we have for health stacking. So it's working for people. So you know go ahead and get in there, I guess. But I have been trying to do this, right? This is why I have made numerous items that have armor and MR ratios, or well, I guess I shouldn't say numerous, but I've made multiple items at this point that have essentially armor and MR ratios that scale with your bonus armor and MR. This is why I've been trying to support the resistance stacking build paths with things that are not damage. And in general, I think yes, we can do this, and I've been working towards this a little bit over the years. But at the same time, you have to understand that ultimately tanks can't be allowed to scale as well as other classes, right? Particularly like damage dealing classes. Damage has to outscale durability in MOBAs. That's why every MOBA ever does that. It's because you need the game to end, right? You need game ending to be inevitable. You need damage to outscale durability in the game, because otherwise your only ways of making sure that the game ends are things that are not directly attached to player actions, right? You want player actions to end the game. You want the end of the game to be because this AD carry killed this tank, or this assassin killed this AD carry. You don't want the game to end because, well, the tank was able to just stonewall everyone and eventually the minions ended, right? That's not a satisfying ending to MOBAs for people, like to games. And so damage has to outscale durability. And so we have limited options in how we can let tanks scale. I've let their durability scale better, but in ways that has counterplay, right? Jack Show can be counterplayed with percent pen, and Protoplasm can be counterplayed by Heal Cut. But I do think there are potentially some utility routes we can let tanks scale. I'm actually a big fan of the idea of giving tanks additional utility that scales with their items. I think that space is potentially pretty rich, and we could potentially make either items or tank kits themselves scale that way. And that's the kind of thing I think here, where I tend to agree that PvP damage for tanks is not something that we want to be much higher than it is today. We've seen versions of tanks that deal more PvP damage than today, right? Like during the first version of the tank mythics, for example, where every tank has a cinder item that like fries people. Don't think that was a super great state of the game. But I think that it is difficult but possible to find other places to let them scale. And I've been working on that in the durability area. I think at this point we're probably pushing the limits of how much durability scaling we can give tanks in the later parts of the game in terms of item rewards. And so it might be time, if we really wanted to push in this area, to think about like, hey, what if some tank utility outputs like CCs, like slows or knockups or stuns or whatever, had a small scaling on their defensive stats, so that, hey, getting really tanky on Ornn means that your E knocks up slightly longer, or getting really tanky on Shen means that your taunt lasts 0.5 seconds longer, or whatever, right? Things like that I think could be cool, and could be interesting for a lot of these tanks. Could be reasonably compelling as ways to scale. Kai'Sa's scaling, formerly scaling, now more early/mid. So I think Kai'Sa's scaling is a really interesting topic. And I think AD carry scaling in general is a really interesting topic. I'm not going to go super in depth on this, but I will mention that looking at, like, if you look at like win rate data on AD carry scaling, you have to keep in mind that they're always playing against another AD carry, right? They are not like the other roles where, as a fighter top laner, sometimes you're going to play against a tank, sometimes you're going to play against something else that gets played in top lane, right? Like a range top laner or a mage top or whatever. In mid lane, you're a mage, you're playing against an assassin some percentage of the time, you're playing against Yasuo some percentage of the time, you're playing against Yone some percentage of the time, right? And so the scaling in other roles is much better differentiated than it is on AD carries, because they're always playing against another AD carry, and both of them are like, well, not literally always, but 99 point something percent of the time they're playing against another AD carry. And that means that their scaling is going to get indexed by the other AD carry, right? So again, keep in mind that just an AD carry that has like a flat win rate curve doesn't mean that they aren't a scaler, basically, because all AD carries scale to some extent. They're actually all multiply, like especially crit AD carries are all quite powerful late game, but they don't necessarily appear that way if you look at their win rate data. Anyway, talking about Kai'Sa specifically, uh, I look at this champion and I let me take off my game designer hat for a second and let me look at her as a player, right? I'm someone who's actually played a lot of Kai'Sa. I think she's maybe my most played ADC of all time. I'm not sure. It's her or Tristana, I think. But maybe Sivir. I'm not actually sure. But the point I'm getting at is I've played a lot of Kai'Sa. And as a player, here are the things that I think have to be true for me to want to play Kai'Sa, like the things that need to be true for her to be fun. Number one is her evolves have to be really satisfying. When I jump through hoops, when you tell me that I have to jump through hoops in the item system, I need to buy these specific items or I need to hit these specific amounts of stats, and I get to have a little ceremony. You're popping this thing up, you're going to change my icon. That has to be satisfying, right? So that needs to be true for me to want to play Kai'Sa. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, me flying across the screen with my ultimate to go behind a squishy target needs to be effective. If I'm not doing that as Kai'Sa, why am I playing her over other AD carries, right? That's the cool, super hype thing that she does, is flies across the screen and assassinates people. Like, as an AD carry, that's her unique strength, right? That is the special thing that she does that no other AD carry can do. And so for Kai'Sa, as a player, that's something that needs to be really exciting. And I think just the way that we sell her animations and her kit as a whole, I think her fifth hit also needs to be satisfying and powerful, right? The fifth hit of the passive also needs to be pretty powerful for her to be fun. And so that's like player side, right? Not game designer. Let me go back to the game designer now. And I look at those three mechanics, right, from my player perspective, and I say, okay, evolves, I want you to have access to those in most, if not all games, at least two of your evolves. Okay, so these are going to be powerful mid-game spikes, okay? Some scaling champions, some hyper carries do have some powerful mid-game spikes. Can be tough, but, it's a good thing. Flying across the screen to assassinate people. Okay, it's going to be hard to make that effectively scale super well because there are limits in how much power we can actually put into a squishy ranged champion going to assassinate other squishy ranged champions, right? Because at the end of the day, sometimes when you do that, you're going to get like W'd by Maokai or hit with Seraphine Ultimate or Ash Arrow or whatever, and you're going to die, right? Like regardless of how big your shield is, sometimes you're just not going to be allowed to execute that maneuver. And so I think that paradigm actually makes a lot of sense, right? The flying across the screen to assassinate squishies, that is something that can be really, really hype in team fights, but it's not going to be something that is going to manifest in every team fight. And so for that thing to be powerful, the time when it makes the most sense for that to be powerful is either in lane, and there are limitations on how good it can be allowed to be in lane, because obviously if you're going to be able to put yourself behind someone with a shield in lane, you probably can't just be able to kill them from full, for example, all the time. So that again makes sense to be a mid-game mechanic to me, where it's like, oh, well, in 3v3s and 4v4s and maybe messy dragon fights and stuff like that, right? Like not full 5v5s, we can make that assassination mechanic quite powerful, and that can be really satisfying. But having it actually scale super hard into the 5v5s is like really difficult and I think unrealistic, because so much of Kai'Sa's power budget, as an AD carry later in the game, is that she just right clicks on people and does a lot of damage. How much power can we really put into I fly across your screen and I'm behind you when you're already going to be killing people, killing squishies in three or four attacks that you get out very quickly, and that you can shred through the tank, the front line pretty effectively as Kai'Sa. It's like, how much power budget do we have to give to that mechanic in the 5v5? Not that much. It's a lot easier for us to give that mechanic the power budget needs to be fun in the early and the, especially I think in the mid game, before you get to the threshold of damage that you need in order to be like just ripping people apart. Because that's just a part of being an AD carry in League of Legends, is that when you hit 3+ items, you do an enormous amount of damage, right? You do a lot of DPS, and your kit doesn't matter for how much damage, for your kit doesn't essentially matter for that. And so that's why AD carries don't get really awesome spells for the most part, or if they do, they aren't really given the tools to auto attack. This is like Smolder, for example. You kind of get one or the other. If your auto attacks are doing a lot of damage, your spells can't really carry super hard unless we give you a really, really, really sharp weakness, like Vayne, for example. Like, yes, Vayne, you know what? Your laning phase is weak and you have no wave clear at all. Good luck, right? And you're allowed to do a lot of really messed up stuff later on in the game because you have those weaknesses. Kai'Sa doesn't have that sharp weakness. And so when I kind of look at Kai'Sa, and I look at like, the third thing I mentioned, by the way, was the 5th hit feeling good. That is something I think can be really satisfying for late game. And currently it is, I think, the part of her kit that scales by far the best because it's just raw missing health damage. But the other two things that I think are critical to the satisfaction of Kai'Sa as a champion, that are critical to her being fun for Kai'Sa players, are mechanics that I think are optimally positioned as mid-game spiking mechanics, which is what leads me down the road of, I believe it's correct for Kai'Sa to be a mid-game champion. Now, I could be wrong about this, right? Like, this is just my personal take off the top. I would be very interested in hearing what a champion designer would think about this, right? This is the kind of question that I would recommend asking August and getting his thoughts, next time you can catch August streaming. But my take as a systems designer and as someone who's played a lot of Kai'Sa is that all these things that I've mentioned kind of lead me to the conclusion that it's correct for Kai'Sa to be a mid-game champion, where she spikes hard on her evolves, and she spikes hard in those, not 5v5s, but in those skirmishes when her ultimate is at its peak of power. And then she falls off a little bit late game. She can still be good, right? Like, I'm not saying she has to be useless late game by any means. She's still going to be an AD carry. She's going to do a lot of damage. But my perspective is that the shape of her kit heavily encourages and heavily rewards a mid-game shape being the best, like the best one for her to be fun. There could be parts of her kit that could scale really well, right? As an example, like we could say her E attack speed scales a little bit better, or she could have better rank up incentives on her W so that she's a little bit stronger when she gets past level 13 or whatever, right? It's like there's some small changes we could do here, but for the kit as a whole, the core mechanics that hook into her core gameplay loop, I look at them and I say these look like mid-game mechanics to me, right? So that's kind of my conclusion here. But again, I'm not a champion designer, so maybe they'd have a different take. Maybe they'd have a different approach of determining like how should an AD carry's power curve be shaped relative to the other AD carries. Because I think it is an interesting topic, and I'm not 100% confident that the things that I've said here are like necessarily the best way of approaching how a champion's power curve should be shaped. So specifically AD carries, because I think because they're indexed in terms of their power curve against other AD carries, thinking about and talking about their scaling is kind of weird because everything is all relative to their opponents, right? And so it's all about whether you do or don't outscale the other AD carry, not about whether you outscale the other champions in the game, right? Which is kind of a weird lens to think about it from. Mid lane marksmen were hit when popular in high elo mid season 14. Is that still correct with Fearless Draft? So, I think there's a couple of things I want to note here. One is that popular in high elo mid season 14, I think, is a bit of a stretch. There were a couple of regions where these champions were somewhat popular for the very, very, very top MMR games. We're talking a very small percentage of games. And they're obviously very popular in pro as well. But this was actually not something that was common in solo queue for almost any players at all. And in fact, there were some regions where even in higher MMRs, these champions just weren't played in solo queue at all. There are some cases where this is not true, right? As an example, Tristana mid was actually fairly popular even before the change, like the introduction of Absorb Life, which was what led to, I think that was the initial thing that led to people trying a lot of these mid lane AD carries. But I do want to be clear that I think that the way that this question is phrased vastly overstates how actually popular or how high affinity this was for most players. There were some cases of some champions that people did actually play in, broader actual solo queue. But let's talk about the actual question here. Is it still correct with Fearless Draft? I don't think Fearless Draft has any influence on this. I think specifically what we were eliminating with the changes that were made to a variety of systems to remove 80 carry the specific type or the specific way that people were playing 80 carries in mid season 14 was people were playing 80 carries mid in season 14 with enormous amounts of sustain such that mages could not contest these champions and assassins would lose to them so hard in the early levels that the 80 carries would just checkmate non 80 carries by by just locking in their champion, right? There were specific rune setups you would take, early itemization, with things like Vamp Scepter, Doran's Blade, and Vamp Scepter in some matchups, etc. With certain optimizations that you could make in our system such that you would just invalidate your opponent's ability to interact with you in lane and you would scale for free. And then you would be an 80 carry with more levels than one that was in bot lane, and so you would be stronger than the enemy's bot lane 80 carry, if they had one. And that, I think it was just very clearly correct to eliminate. I do not think it's correct to say, hey, here's this class, like, regardless of whether it's good, the gameplay is good or not, here's this class that just invalidates the other classes in this lane by locking in and out-sustaining their mana pools or bullying you so hard in the first few levels that you can't play. That's just wrong, right? Like, and that would be wrong as an example if they did, 80 carries went top lane and did that, or fighters went into the bot carry position and did that, right? Like, that's just wrong no matter where it is. Now, I think there's a more interesting question of how could we get 80 carries to be viable in a different way in mid lane? Because I think it would be totally reasonable if we had like Ezreal mid, for example, as a cool pick that people could do, or even a version of Tristana mid, which could be really cool, right? Like, I think Tristana mid is a bit scary because she was so, like, the version of Tristana mid that people actually played a lot was just so good at killing people at level 2 and level 3. That kind of scares me a little from the perspective of like a shape perspective of, well, she's really good at killing you, but she also outscales you, is not a paradigm that I personally am a huge fan of in our game. But ultimately, there are maybe some individual champions that I think could be good candidates for mid lane if we had interesting ways of enabling them, as long as the way that we enable them is not the way they were enabled specifically in mid-season 14, where they're taking Absorb Life, they're taking Fleet Footwork, they're buying Vamp Scepter, they're ignoring your damage, they're just out-sustaining you, and every single time you try to trade with them, they're auto-attacking you back, and their damage doesn't cost a resource, so they'll always, chip trade you out and win the extended play, and then they just outscale you. That is not good, right? That's just not a good state of the game. But I think there are other potential avenues to get more 80 carries mid that are, that could be more reasonable, that could be more interesting, especially with some of these specific champions that, that we can look at and say, hey, you know what? Ezreal has a lot of properties that are kind of similar to mages. He's a caster, right? Like, especially a lot of the caster 80 carries, I think, are somewhat reasonable candidates if we could find a good way. Now, I don't off the top of my head have a pitch of like, oh, well, actually what we should do is we should, lower all these 80 carries armor by 3 and raise their base health by 30 and, do these base stat changes, and suddenly they'll be good in mid and they'll be exactly the same in bot or anything like that, right? Always the risk with this is, okay, if we did decide to make changes, what does that do for them in their primary roles? Because we want to support them in bot lane first. That's the number one thing we need to do for these 80 carries. And so what would the costs that we would need to pay be in order to make these champions functional in mid? And if that would come at a meaningful cost of bot lane, I think the answer is that we probably just wouldn't do it, because we'd rather have them be happy and fun in bot lane than maybe open up something fringe for a very small player base, like a very, very, very small player base for most of these champions in mid lane potentially. But the idea of 80 carries in mid doesn't offend me from a gameplay perspective. It's just the part that offends me is in season 14, the way that they were doing it was by ignoring you and out sustaining you in all cases, which that was not good. So that version of it, I don't think was particularly good. But I don't think this really has anything to do with Fearless. I don't think this really has any relation at all to draft changes or how the pro meta has changed over time. It's just, yeah, champions that go into a lane that are like that are a role that's not typically played there, that can't be pushed out of lane and outscale you, yeah, we probably aren't supposed to have those champions in that lane unless we're putting some other limitations on them. All right. Health regeneration being a more supported / attractive stat within the item system. So this is something that we've talked about a number of times over the years. It's something that I've put proposals in for this. I've had other people propose things for this that I've seen that seemed cool. I think the way that I look at this is that health regeneration is very unexciting, but it is mildly functional, right? It's something where, yeah, it's a stat that's okay early game. It's not very exciting at all, but it does do the thing that it says, and it's fine. I think that there being an item, for example, that scales off of your health regeneration, that does something interesting that you do care about, that could be really cool. I've proposed a number of those before. Haven't actually ever tested any prototypes of that, but could be something cool. I think a version of health regen where it has a scaling, like, where we rename the stat and make it scale with level or something like that, so that it's actually more useful late game. I could see doing a version of that, right, where it's like, oh, actually, instead of health regen, we give you vitality, and every one vitality is equivalent to, at levels 1 through 9, 100% base health regeneration, and after level 9, it actually scales harder so that your health regen items actually do something late game or whatever, right? Like that exact pitch might not be good, right? There's just an example of like something that we could do, but something along those lines of a version of the stat that actually does something. One really out there pitch that I think it's Soul Crushed pitched this years ago that I've heard was combining health regen and heal and shield power into one stat. Called whatever something random I don't remember what the exact pitch was, but combine it into one stat such that there's like this overlap between the enchanter system and the tank system where tanks can get a little bit of heal and shield power, but enchanters get some health regen, and there's some interesting overlap there for like Taric, for example, or Rakan, where they can be at the benefits of both like both sides at once, because they're melee or pseudo melee and actually care about their heal and shield power for other people. Stuff like that. I think there's some interesting pitches that I've seen for this. I think this is the kind of thing that could be really cool. And so, from my perspective, I wouldn't be surprised if this was something that we wanted to pursue in the future. I also wouldn't be surprised. I have heard some pitches of just, yeah, what if we just cut health regeneration and we replaced it with something that is a little bit more directly compelling, like something that players will read and say, oh, I actually really want that, right? Whereas health regen, I think for the most part, people read it and they're like, well, I kind of get it, but I also don't really want it, right? Like I understand what this is doing, vaguely, right? I think not a lot of players understand exactly what base regen is all about, or that like different champions have or can have very different base regen, right? As an example, Briar gets nothing from health regen, just a fun fact, because she has no base health regen. But yeah, anyway, to sum it up, I think absolutely we could do something in this space in the future. It's something we've discussed before. Wouldn't be surprised if we wanted to revisit it if we ever do a bigger pass on the tank system, because this is obviously very tied into the tank system at this point, where we just have Crystal Embracer as as an epic item that just builds into a lot of our legendaries and just gives them health regen. So something I could definitely see us visiting in the future, but not something. It's, how do I put this? It's not on fire. And so while people talk about it, we've never looked at it as, oh man, we really need to address this, right? It functions, right? It works. And so we haven't looked at it as something that we absolutely must deal with in the immediate future. So at some point, it'll probably get looked at. Milio's passive and Echoes of Helia. This was just talking about how not all of his passive damage stacks Helia. This one I'll just quickly go through as like, yeah, I think all of his passive should count for the new Echoes. Like, technically, I think it should count as damage that like Milio deals. The reason why it's so wonky, by the way, is because it's using a kind of wonky system to make sure that the kill credit is attributed to the person who is buffed, but that the damage gets attributed to Milio for the purposes of the end of game stat screen. So there's a lot of wonkiness there because that system is relatively newer and it's just not it's not super fleshed out. But yeah, I don't have too much to say about this other than that. Yeah, I think that all of Milio's passive should count for Helia. That seems like pretty much just straight upside. I don't have too much to say about it other than that. Yeah, it should work. Is making a character hard for the sake of hard a bad thing? My immediate answer to this is it depends, right? I think that this a lot depends on what the goals of your game are and what the goals of your character are and what you're trying to do. There are a lot of games that have, there are different terms for this in game design. There's like some people call it like Nintendo hard. That's a really old term. Some people call it like fake difficulty. There's all sorts of different terminology you can use here, but there are a lot of entire game genres built around raw mechanical difficulty that essentially has no what I would call purpose, right? So hey, here's a really difficult to execute combo in a fighting game that's really hard to do. Is there a reason it has to be this hard? Not really. It's just something that the designers wanted that in some cases works really well for that audience, and that's fine. Sometimes it's, well, we have to have this crazy sequence of inputs, and this is just, part of this being really hard is emergent gameplay of, well, it's this specific sequence of moves that on an individual level aren't that complicated, but when you layer them all together in this exact specific way, it becomes extremely difficult to execute. And so there's different types of hard for the sake of hard. But my perspective on this is a lot of what makes this question interesting is character driven games are very different from other types of games, right? League decided to take the MOBA genre and run really hard at the character focus part of the game, like part of the genre, right? This is one of the things that separated League in the early days from the other MOBAs that were around, was that League much more heavily focused on character fantasies and having more characters and expanding the roster and focusing on the roster of characters rather than on the systems, right? And that's still true to this day, though to a lesser degree, I think. Obviously we've done a lot more work systemically over the past, say, like 6 years or so than we have on our characters. But generally speaking, League is a much more character-driven game, and I think part of what makes that effective, what makes that really work for League, is that we can have experiences in the game that are hard for the sake of being hard, and that can be really good for the audience that wants that experience, but everyone else doesn't have to opt into that, right? Good comparison here is in the tactical shooter genre, right? You look at like the popularity of hero shooters today, for example, right? Look at tac shooters, right? Look at the difference between Counter-Strike and Valorant. In Valorant, you can offer a really specific type of experience to a player that doesn't have to appeal to everyone, like Neon, for example. For those who haven't played Valorant, Neon is the character who basically like runs really fast around the game. Sprinting is a huge part of power budget. She's just faster than everyone else. She runs really fast, and she's I believe still a little better at aiming while sliding than while moving essentially than other characters in the game. And that's the kind of experience you wouldn't want to put in Counter-Strike, because if you put that in Counter-Strike, everyone has to have that experience, right? And it's probably not good for all of your players. In fact, I don't think that experience would be good for all of Valorant's players. But it can be good for a subset of Valorant's players. It can be really good for them. And so having these types of these types of experiences on your characters lets you do two really big important things for character-driven games. And I think this is what drives a lot of the popularity of the hero shooter genre. Is number one is it lets you cast your net wider in terms of the appeal to your audience, right? It lets you say, hey, I'm going to make a character-driven game, and because of that, I can have things that appeal to this audience, things that appeal to this other audience, and things that appeal to this third audience that all don't really share a lot of these things in common, except that they like this sort of general genre, but they like different things about it. And I can really drill in and appeal to those specific things on these specific characters. And that's the second thing that does really well, is that it says, hey, if you want to hyper serve a really specific audience, you want to make a character that really works for this specific type of player, you can do that, right? And it doesn't have to be a super broadly appealing character that, they can still be successful while having a small but, dedicated audience, right? This is like Singed, for example, or Riven to a lesser degree. Riven, I think, is an example sort of both, to a lesser degree, of like, well, she is just kind of hard for the sake of being hard, right? Her Q cancel essentially is just mechanical input that equates to attack speed, effectively, is what it's doing. And then she has double casting, which is a mechanical input that, it equates to removing your cast times and being able to cast multiple spells at the same time. But ultimately, the way that I look at Riven is she is kind of a character that's hard for being the sake of hard, and that's good for League because League has a ton of characters, and we can afford to spend a character slot on that. One of the things I look at is that, there are some of these, some indie games that I've played that are character driven, for example, and I think that one of the things that I've seen go wrong in a number of games in this space is like, oh, you have 5 characters and you spent 1 or 2 of your character slots appealing to this really narrow thing, and maybe it is good for those players, but you only have 5 characters in your game, and so therefore you can't really afford to spend an entire character slot for this really narrowly appealing thing, because you need enough characters to satisfy your core audience, right? And so a lot of whether a character being hard for the sake of hard, being good or bad, comes down to the context of the game that they're in, and what the purpose of your game is, and like what the purpose of you having characters in your game is. But in general, though, the way that I look at this is that having being a character-driven game means that you get to make stuff like this that can appeal to a specific type of player without forcing your entire player base to opt into that. And that's, I think, one of the things that's so great about League is that even if you don't love, you don't like Riven, right? Maybe you love Singed instead because there's no mechanics really, right? And you actually just want that really cerebral experience of thinking about, when you're going to proxy and when you can all in people, and understanding all these thresholds of like, the distance that you're going to cover, and the, how close people are, and understanding where, when you're supposed to ghost and ult and all of these other, timing related things, right? Or maybe you don't like any of that stuff, and actually you just like the feeling of Jinx's auto attack, and you just want to right click on people and watch them explode, right? This is one of the things that's so great about League, is that we offer this extremely diverse and extremely deep pool of characters that offers, something to almost everyone, right? And that's part of what's great about being a character-driven game, which is why I think they're a lot more popular today than they were, 17 years ago when League of Legends was being made. Heal and shield power rename. This is one that comes up internally every so often. We definitely talk about it probably every year. The thing that's interesting about it is that when you think about this relative to the renaming of armor penetration to lethality, it's actually kind of the opposite, where one of the core reasons why we renamed flat armor pen to lethality was that a lot of players, less experienced and newer players especially, would get confused. They would, look at people building armor against them, and then, the rudimentary understanding of the system says, that says armor penetration, I should probably buy this brutalizer against this person who has a chain vest. And that's actually really bad. Flat armor penetration is bad against armor, right? And heal and shield power is actually kind of the opposite, where it is literally exactly descriptive of what it does. If you're someone who heals or shields a lot, you actually do want heal and shield power. And so one of the things that we lose in renaming it is, while yes, it is wordy and it's not, it's not a sexy name at all, it is literally descriptive of what it does, right? And so there is something that we lose there if we do decide to rename heal and shield power at some point, which is something I think that might happen still. Who knows? Some people do really like the idea. Some people don't like the idea. Some people are neutral on it. I would consider myself to be one of the more neutral people. I not super attached either way. But it is something I'm sure will continue to come up internally. It'll get discussed every year, and maybe one day we'll decide to actually go forward with that. But in general, though, I would say that my perspective on heal and shield power is that while it doesn't sound very good, it is a great descriptor of what it's doing, and so that in and of itself does have some pretty strong upside. All right, thoughts on making Black Cleaver stack with percent pen items again? Personally, I'm not a big fan of this. So the reason why we undid this, or like why we said you're not allowed to stack percent pen and Cleaver, or you're not allowed to stack multiple percent pen items, was because it meant that armor was ineffective against the champions that it was supposed to be good against, right? You would encounter a Talon at 25 minutes who had, 3-item Talon, 25 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, shows up with Black Cleaver and Serylda's to your lane, and you realize, hey, I bought these ninja tabbies or whatever, or I bought this GA even, right, later on in the game, and the armor does basically nothing, right? It's actually not worth it at all. It means that health becomes the only counter to these champions, which is really undesirable, right? We actually want armor to be good against them. And in fact, if armor is good against these champions, that means that they can do more damage, right? Like if armor is actually a good counter to them, that means that they get to deal more damage, and they get to probably be a bit more early game skewed, which I think is generally a positive for people who play these champions. I think a lot of the people who play AD Assassins especially would love to exchange a little bit of their scaling power in exchange for early game. And this would be doing the opposite of that, right? Like if we give you stacking percent pen, we have to nerf your early game, right? We have to pull power somewhere, right? Because you'll just be dealing way more damage late game because you can effectively mitigate over 50% of their armor, right? The problem we run into here is just that it makes items like Death's Dance really ineffective. Like the armor itself on the item just becomes not useful, not powerful. And it leads to us needing to load even more power in items into other effects that actually end up being, I think, more frustrating for the assassins. Where it's like, well, this means that GA has to be cheaper for the same amount of armor because the armor isn't doing anything against the assassins that it's supposed to be effective against, right? Similarly for like Death's Dance in some cases, or for like Tabbies in some cases, where it's like, well, if the armor isn't doing much against a lot of the champions that you would want it to be good against, then we're either going to have to make those champions do less damage, or we're going to have to get, make the other parts of those items that can be effective against assassins, or the other items that are effective against those assassins, more powerful, right? Because at the end of the day, everyone has to be balanced and tuned, right? So in general, I'm not really a fan of this. I think my personal objections to this, the strong point of my objection to this mechanic are, number one, I really dislike how it makes AD assassins scale really well because they get to ignore your armor. That's number one. And number two, I think it makes it so that it's very hard for us to tune tanks in particular, interacting with assassins, because it makes it so that a lot of the assassins can actually interact pretty favorably with tanks, because it's like, well, okay, so I am playing Maokai and I have 250 armor. And then I interacted with Talon and I effectively only had, less than 100 armor when I was interacting with him because he, shredded 30% of my armor. He has 35% penetration, and then he has 40 lethality or whatever the numbers are, right? Okay, so why did I buy armor exactly? My like going from 200 to 250 armor effectively gave me like 5% more health or whatever the number is. It's a very small amount, right? It's like, so why am I bothering with armor, right? One of the things this does is it puts a lot of stress on our systems in terms of what's valuable against these champions on like armor versus health. And I really dislike that because it makes it hard for us to tune the tank system, especially if you go back into, I forget whether this is number 9 or number 10. I'm talking about how we generally resistance skewed our tank systems because that does a lot of good things in other areas for them. It makes it so that doesn't make sense if assassins can, largely ignore your armor, or armor is largely ineffective against assassins. It makes it so that tanks then are more vulnerable to assassins in a lot of ways than fighters are, which is distinctly incorrect. Tanks should be the least threatened class by assassins, and if assassins have a lot of effective armor countering, that can't be true because the fighters are the ones who are getting the health skewed items and the tanks are the ones getting the resistance skewed items. And so in general, I'm really not a big fan of the idea of re-enabling the stacking of these items, unless we say, like, as an example, we could do it if they were less efficient stacked together in some way, such that stacking them was only good if stacking them together was like only good if they truly had so much armor, right? Like, oh, you're against Malphite and this is the only way you can deal any damage to him or whatever, right? It's like, and it's not super efficient, but it's a cost, trade-off that you can opt into to give up some of your ability to hit squishies in exchange for a better ability to interact with a larger breadth of targets. That could maybe be okay if there's an appropriate trade-off, but the version of this that we had in the game previously did not have an appropriate trade-off. It just made you good at killing everyone, which I think is incorrect, right? Like, it was good against squishies, it was good against the tanks, it meant that armor was useless for the most part. I really didn't love that. All right. Why do ranged champions get so many items only for them? Short answer is that they don't. These three aren't, like, Rageblade can be functional on some melees, right? As an example, there have been versions of Belveth that have bought Rageblade. Master Yi can buy Rageblade. There have been versions of Rageblade that Aurelia has purchased in the past, not the current one, but in the past that has been the case. I don't actually think this is true. Hex Optics, I made because we were looking for a teamfight 80 carry pop-off item. It's not specifically that I made it because it's only supposed to be for ranged champions. It's just, hey, do you think that Horizon Focus is only for ranged champions? I mean, it is, but only because it's for artillery mages, right? And it's like, well, part of that is hitting people from really far away. Ultimately, there's actually more items that are really only intended to be used for melees or the purpose of them is to be for melees, right? This is items like Death's Dance. This is items like Sterax Gauge. This is items like Titanic Hydra. Actually, every Hydra, really. And so on and so forth. There's actually more items that are designed exclusively for melee champions, and ranged champions are an afterthought than there are for ranged. Now, I will point out for Runons, I actually had a version of Runons that was on the PB that worked on melee champions. I actually thought that was pretty cool, and I thought the gameplay was mostly good. I mean, the Master Yi thing was maybe not chill, maybe it was unchill. But the reason why we pulled that wasn't because we thought it was like terrible or unshippable or anything. It was just at that time we didn't have the QA resources to actually go through and check and like fix all of the problems with all of the melee champions that worked. I think if you go back and you look at the melee Runons on PB, you probably can find like a Vanderil video or a Hextech Lab video or something of some of the various bugs that were had, which I didn't realize were there when I put it on the PB. Like Gangplank, for example, and Alawi did some really weirdo stuff with melee Runons. So there would have been a lot of time fixing it, and at that time we kind of just said like, okay, we don't have the time to fix this. Let's just not do it, because it was just kind of a cool side thing I was doing at the time, not like something I was working on for main purpose. But anyway, I think it'd be cool if Runons worked on melees. The reason why it originally didn't work on melees was that the original way it was made just literally didn't function on them, not because they were saying melees can't be allowed to have this thing. Anyway, so to get at the actual point here, number one is I think ranged champions don't have so many items only for them. I would say it's really just 2 in our current game, which is Runons and Hex Optics. Maybe 3 if you're stretching and saying Horizon Focus, which I guess is technically true. But there are far more items for melees, and I don't actually think this is a problem, right? Like, this question kind of presupposes that there is something fundamentally wrong with different types of champions getting different items made for them. And in fact, that's actually how the whole item system works, is that we make items for specific sets of champions, for specific subsets of champions that have certain properties. Range is one of those properties, right? We make items for AP fighters. We make items for AD fighters. We make items for divers. We make items for AD assassins. We make items for AD assassins that are laners. We make items that are for items that are, or we make items for items. What am I talking about? We make items for mages that go mid. We make items for mages that go in the jungle, right? Like, we do all sorts of things. And some of those things are multi-purpose, right? Like Faded Ashes, one of the reasons why I made that item was so that we could have an easier time putting mages in the jungle without needing to give them absolutely insane jungle damage mods on their spells, right? And that ended up being dual purpose because we could also have a cool Faded Ashes that worked for mid lane mages and mages elsewhere, right? And that was great. But sometimes we put restrictions on them because we don't want specific things happening, or in the case of Runons, because the original one literally just didn't work for melees, just didn't function. But of course, it's been remade a number of times since then. But yeah, ultimately my response to this is just, it isn't a problem if there are items made for specific types of champions. And even if it were, it is weird to hear this complaint about ranged champions, because melee champions actually have more items that are for them than ranged champions do. There's a lot, there are a bunch of items that have ranged melee splits, and every single one is in favor of the melee champions, right? That's because melee champions are at an innate disadvantage in League of Legends. Range is really powerful. And so the item system on the whole generally quite favors melee champions. In fact, almost all of our systems do. The rune system favors melees. The item system favors melees. The turret overgrowth favors melees, as an example, right? It gives you extra range to hit the turret with, right? Like, you can find all sorts of examples of our systems favoring melee champions because they need the help, right? And so it is weird for me to see a complaint about ranged champions getting items when it's like, well, they have a couple of items that are for them. That's not a problem. State of Lich Bane, specifically after Dusk and Dawn introduction. This is an interesting one. I think there's a couple of different things going on here. Number one is I do think that for some of these champions where we tuned them for a world where their fighter builds were pretty under-supported, right, like Echo and Diana, they have ratios in places that are probably not correct in a world where they have an actually properly supported fighter build, right? Like Echo passive and Diana passive, both, I think the ratios are probably a bit too high, and that makes it so that Dusk and Dawn is actually doing bursty, supporting the burst-based builds a little bit too well. Though I will note, if you take a look at Diana mid, for example, where she's pure assassin, she doesn't have any fighter properties, she actually does win more games with Lich Bane there, but you're much more likely to be exposed to versions of these champions because they're much more popular in jungle, where the fighter build is heavily encouraged, right? Like having health on your first item is highly desirable in the jungle, so that you can like actually scrap people in the river and stuff like that, right? There's a lot of reasons why the builds for mid versus jungle are very different, but that's one thing. Another thing is I think that Lich Bane just hasn't really. I think that it's kind of not aged as well as it should have since like season 14. I think the early season 14 version was really good, and then we nerfed its AP ratio, and we changed the build path, and we changed the build path again, and we retooled the amount of AP it had. It'll reduce the AP. I don't think that the current version of Lich Bane is as good as it could or should be. I would love personally to bring the AP ratio on Lich Bane up to like 45 or even 50%. It's currently 40%. I do think that it could be a bit more distinct, and that could be one of the things that it does a little better. In general, though, I think this is, hey, we have some champions that were heavily tuned around the fact that their fighter build didn't really exist, right? They weren't really properly supported in the item system. And this is something we've seen over the years many times as we've supported things that were previously under supported, right? Like as an example, when we added real fighter items to the game, a lot of our existing fighters like Darius and Jax had to get a lot of changes to match the fact that, hey, you can keep buying damage. There's real items for you to keep scaling damage and durability over game time. And that is something that we had to manage over the course of, hey, it actually turns out Jax is too tanky, or it turns out that Darius is doing too much damage without building damage, or now that he has this ability, or he's doing too much damage when he does build damage, or whatever, right? Like, I think this is just a sort of systemic artifact, if that makes sense, around the fact that, yeah, we started to support something that previously didn't exist. We did a lot of tuning in the past based on the assumption that these items didn't exist, because they didn't. And because of that, I think we loaded a lot of power, and specifically a lot of ratio skewed power into these champions passives that probably shouldn't be there today. At least not with the current shape of the item system. All of this having been said, another option, and maybe we should do all of these things, but another part of this is, it is possible that Dusk and Dawn is maybe just a little bit too good up front, and it needs something to extend its pattern. I've heard lots of different pitches, internally and externally, for how that could work. As an example, we could have a version of it where it builds out of Haunting Guys, and every Sheen proc gives you a stack of 2% damage amp up to 10, or 8, or sorry, up to 10%, not 10 stacks. That would be crazy. But there's versions where, maybe it could have a ramping effect on the Sheen proc itself, or any of these things, right? Like, there's all sorts of different versions of it, I think, that we could go for if we really felt like that, that was something that was necessary. But I will say, I think that this effect is, to me, mostly localized to Diana and Echo, where those are the champions where, because of the way that their kits are tuned, they are doing, I think, inappropriate levels of burst when they build Dusk and Dawn into full AP. And this doesn't manifest on the other champions that build Dusk and Dawn, right? The Gwens of the world, for example, where it's like, well, Gwen doesn't do a bunch of bursts with Dusk and Dawn because she already had a supported build, and we don't have some ludicrous AP ratio on her attacking you 4 times or something like that, right? Like, Volibear isn't bursting you super hard because he has Dusk and Dawn, right? And, his burst is very similar to what he does with other items, that have similar amounts of AP on them, right? And so when I think about the shape of the champions that buy Dusk and Dawn currently, yeah, I mean, maybe we could do some adjustments to Dusk and Dawn. I don't think that that's unreasonable, but I kind of look at this as a confluence of multiple different problems of, like, these items, like Dusk and Dawn doing Lich Bane's job on these couple of specific champions, I do think is not ideal. That much is fair. All right, one last bonus question, and then we'll wrap this one up. After combat, report while alive, not only after death. So this is something we've explored, like, not recently, but many years ago we were exploring a version of this. I think it's actually pretty interesting. I like the idea a lot personally. I think the difficulty is a lot in how we present this information to the player, how we make sure that it's actually useful and good information to the player, all these kinds of things. I think there's a lot of questions that have to be answered about what a combat report looks like in a MOBA that actually presents good information, right? Like one of the examples of like one of these things that we tested in the past was it literally just when you hit tab, it would show you here's the last 1,000 damage that you took from champions. Here is the split of physical magic true. Didn't tell you who it was from. Didn't tell you anything else about it. Just the last 1,000 damage you took 800 physical damage, 200 magic damage, or whatever, right? And there were some problems with that. A lot of times it was like, well, what about the 2,000 damage I took before that, right? Or, well, what spells were that? Or like, who was I fighting? I don't remember. Or things like that, right? There were a lot of questions there. I think it's tough because it's a lot of information and it's really hard to know exactly how to present that to the player and what exactly is the right kind of information to present. It's the kind of thing where every time I think about these kinds of topics, I'm so glad I'm not a UX designer because these problems are like so, how do I put this? There's never any super it's hard to come up with a super satisfying answer to these kinds of questions of like how do I know which parts of the information are important to the player? What should the rules be on what of this information I'm displaying? Because like just your last 10,000 damage that you took is a really terrible version of this. Obviously that's going to be useless, right? And so it's like, okay, do you discount anything that was more than 30 seconds ago? What if they want to see that? Do you remove anything that's not from the last instance of combat? Well, what if they get poked by a spell and they want to know about that spell? Like, there's so many questions to answer here, and this just makes me so happy that I'm not a UX designer because I feel like these are the kinds of questions that I would be, if I were a UX designer, I'd be agonizing over all of the time of like, what information do I show to people, and how do I know that that's the right information to show, or that this is the right rules for what information I'm showing? It's just such a difficult thing to ask or thing to answer. In total, though, I do agree some kind of combat report could be really nice for League in terms of offering players an easier way to learn what's going on and like what terms of what's happening to them without needing to actually die to review that information. I will say this is the kind of feature that I don't think should be a super high priority because not that many people will use it, and the people that do use it, a lot of them won't get crazy high amounts of value out of it. But it is a nice to have, like a nice feature that I think would be good if we ever found the right time and place to do it. Is kind of my conclusion about this. So that's kind of where I'm at on after combat report. Could be good. Probably not something that we should spend huge amounts of priority or time on. And that's it. That's going to be the end of it for number 11 here, Q&A. Thanks for watching, and catch you next time.